Welcome back. Let's talk psychoanalysis, the great granddaddy of all psychological treatments for mental distress. And this, hopefully you can see it. Here's a picture of Freud's couch. That literally is Sigmund Freud's couch in Sigmund Freud's office. I'd like to draw your attention to the little green chair up at the head of the couch. So the arrangement here is really important. The arrangement of psychoanalysis is the patient lays down on the couch facing away from the analyst, and the analyst sits over there with their notepad out of the view, out of the sight line of the patient. The analyst is going to make really minimal contributions, occasionally the mildest of interpretations, mostly just prompts and prompts for free association. And the patient can talk about really whatever they would like to talk about. So this is orthodox analysis, the way Freud would do it. Very few people would still practice this way in the modern world. But some of the stuff that Freud is doing and some of the ideas he has, they carry forward the modern thing that we call psychoanalysis or even psychodynamic therapy, right? It has its genes, its biological origin, its body base in this practice. So notice that chair out of view, because what we're going for is transference, all right? Freud doesn't believe that he has a relationship with the patient. The patient's talking, he's back there doing almost nothing, and sometimes the patient gets annoyed with him, or idolizes him or something. And they start to talk about Dr. Freud in a context. And Freud just sees this as transference. It's not that they love or hate me, it's that this reminds them of some relationship they had in the past. Freud is providing them an ambiguous stimulus, just like those Rorschach ink blots we talked about earlier in the term. Freud himself here is an ambiguous stimulus to be seen by the patient really however they want to see him. And when they treat him as though he were their mom and they were 5, or he's their boss at work, or whatever it is, that is transference. We've transferred that relationship onto this context. He set that up on purpose, all right? So we could be really critical of that. I'm an existentialist, and in fact, I will be critical of that. I think that we have a relationship now, and I see this as really a way of avoiding the fact of the relationship now, because we're uncomfortable with it for some reason. But there's that. He's done it on purpose exactly to elicit this transference reaction. Why? So that we can recapitulate that relationship. We can have that relationship again, but you're going to have it in your mind with the mental models of the people you've created instead of back in history, which can't be changed. Okay. Transference is good. We want it. Okay, so like your amateur armchair therapist is going to say, oh, that's transference. It's bad. Let's cure it. No, Freud wants the transference. He's created the conditions to get it. What's bad is countertransference. So the patient treats Freud like he's their mommy in 1902 or something. Okay, good. We can work through that. But when he starts to respond as though he were, right? You've been sort of duped into a relational style that's actually nothing to do with you. Your dad was an authoritarian, and now the patient is doing and saying things to cast you in the authoritarian role, and you accept that role. That's countertransference. That's bad. Your job in the Freudian analysis is just to stay loose, man. It's to provide minimal input, minimal guidance, and let the patient work through it, okay? So transference, good. Countertransference, bad. Got it? Fantastic. Tattoo it on your arm or something. Don't do that. If you do it, don't blame me. What else about Freud? Freud wants to do dream work, and again, we could be critical of this. Instead of working on what's in front of us in the room, we're working on what we thought about last night while we were asleep. Okay, but Freud is surprising here. Freud refers to dreams, obviously, as the royal road to the unconscious, probably the most quoted thing ever said by Uncle Siggy. But Freud is surprisingly respectful when it comes to dream work. If you're going to read one book on dream work, read Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams. Okay? He's very, very standoffish about this. The dreams belong to the patient. Like, I get a view inside their mind, and maybe I have my own list of interpretations that I'm writing down that no one will ever see. But I'm saying almost nothing about the dreams to the patient. What I want to know is, what does the patient think it means? Their interpretations are the most important interpretations. They should be allowed to do their own psychological excavation and learn about their self. When I start throwing in interpretation, then because of the nature of our relationship, the patient is really tempted to believe those interpretations, and then something really important has been lost, right? Dreams, do they matter, or are they about something that's real? Well, it depends how you want to think about it. In modernity, we sort of take the biochemical view of dreams, that dreams are more or less random activity. It's neural cascades. While you're asleep, neural networks fire over and over again to deepen the neural channels. And so probably what you've been through in the last day or the last 2 days, those are the networks that are firing to make sure that the important aspects of those experiences encode properly, stay encoded, get maintained. So you might dream about stuff that happened, but in a disconnected, random fashion. The frontal lobe's not really there to organize things into a narrative, so it doesn't have to make any sense. It's more efficient that way. Each brain region then can do the thing that it needs to do without worrying about creating a unified, integrated reality. Okay, cool. The thing is that dreaming happens the way we would talk about dreaming. It happens as you're sort of rising to consciousness. You're not in the deep theta wave period of sleep. You're up pushing between beta and alpha at the top of the sleep cycle. So you're starting to wake up, and the frontal lobe is coming online, grabbing all of these weird stimuli that aren't meant to be part of a narrative or an experience. But that's the job of the frontal lobe, is to stitch that together into some kind of narrative, right? So that part isn't really random. The way you make sense of ambiguous stimuli, for Freud, that is the only thing about you. That's the only thing about you. The way that you interpret experience, right? When you look at that Rorschach plate, and it could be anything, but you come up with this, that's special and unique and informative, and for sure open to a lot of interpretation. What Freud is saying is, be so careful, because while the patient is looking at this ambiguous stimulus and trying to puzzle it out, you are looking at their retelling of an ambiguous stimulus. In other words, your stimulus is even more ambiguous, and when you interpret that, you're telling the patient way more about yourself than about their self. Their job is to tell you about their self, not the opposite. So back off, Jack. So read this book. Curiously respectful, in fact, from Uncle Sigmund. Interpretation. Really central to the practice of psychodynamic, psychoanalytic, orthodox therapy, interpreting things. So we have this explanatory framework, and at its heart is the idea of the unconscious mind and the subconscious mind. Not everything you think you know about. In fact, your frontal lobes seem really invested in not letting some kinds of information into consciousness. The thing is that we're talking about abstractions. Whenever we're talking thoughts, we're talking abstractions. Thoughts have no form. They do not have any structure. They sometimes reflect biological structures in the brain, but thoughts don't have structure. They're not things. The id, ego, and superego form the basis of Freud's speculation about everything, really, about how brains work. Um, but that explanatory framework is nonsensical. We're off in the realm of reification, where you're saying one abstraction is another abstraction that has no grounding. It's not based on any kind of empirical observation of things we can see and agree upon. It's worse than unprovable speculation. It's a nonsense game. It's castles built in the sky castles. Does that matter? Does it matter? A modern practitioner of psychoanalysis is usually actually going to agree. They might get defensive about it, but they're really going to agree that this stuff is unprovable. It's not meant to be proven. It's like a modern interpretation of the Bible. A modern Christian will usually say that stuff was never meant to be taken literally. There's meaning in the stories. Mhm. Same. It's when you start to take it literally that it's a problem. It's never meant to be literal. It's meant to provide an explanatory framework, and that's helpful to the patient or client, as we'd say now, and it's helpful to us to have some way to frame the experience while we attend to it, while we witness it. It gives our brain something to do so that we're not merely traumatized by the traumas of the person, and we're not roped into their field. We have our own field, and it's an organized field. Does it matter that it's nonsensical? No. Right? The dodo bird verdict. Remember, all of one and all shall have prizes. Psychoanalytic therapies are robustly effective. They're not better than behaviorism and cognitive behavioral work and humanism, and they're not worse. They're not worse. They're all basically the same. And your success depends on things other than your beliefs and what specific kind of therapy you practice. As we get into this work, we need to kind of forget about the epistemology that we push at the start of class, right? That postmodern empiricism. You base your beliefs on data, and you can never prove anything true. You can only attempt to prove it false and fail. Well, that stuff matters, but it matters when we're talking efficacy. All right? How useful are these ideas? It turns out pretty hecking useful. Are they true? No. No. Most generously, we could say we could never prove them false. All right? Good. So when we get deeper into the analyses of analysis, it turns out that people really can use an explanatory framework. For the layperson, there's no difference between a neurobiological explanation and a psychoanalytic explanation. Any explanatory framework helps them conceive of their experience in a useful, organized way. So I've forgotten the source of this research, and it might even be apocryphal. Your language lesson for the day: apocryphal is Greek for bullshit. Okay, so this is the way that I learned about psychoanalysis, and efficacy way back in grad school, before any of us were born. So there's this rural psychoanalyst, and he starts to get the idea that the stories he's telling people about what Freud thought was happening in the mind, they just don't really seem true to people. They don't make any sense, you know. Taking these ideas put together in Europe in the 1890s through the 1920s and trying to explain this stuff to people in like rural Pennsylvania or wherever we are, farmers, they just can't wrap their heads around any of the ideas. So he's like, um, does it matter whether this stuff is true? Because the people seem to get better, even though they don't seem to understand, you know, Electra complex and all that stuff, penis envy and whatever. What if we just made up an explanatory framework? And he does, and he comes up with a theory of mind and diagrams it out, and um, comes up with just words for theories and reasons things might be happening, and he writes it all down. And he drives around, because that's what he does. He drives around from farm to farm, giving people psychological help. That's rural work. And so instead of using Freud's system, he uses this own system that is totally arbitrary, made up, and based on nothing. And people still get better. They get as much better as they do when we're putting it in Freud's terms. It's not whether or not Freud was right that matters. It's whether we mutually have some framework through which we can interpret our experience. So we can do the work of metacognition, thinking about our thinking, distancing ourselves from our thinking, distancing ourselves from our experience. Does it matter if it's nonsense? No. You could certainly come up with some harmful nonsense, right, if you wanted to. That's not what we're talking about. Okay, so post-Freud, we have, there's a little blurb basically in here on play therapy for children. So we're just going to sit in the room and have experiences. The kid basically is going to dream right there in front of us. Same concept in art therapy. The person's going to create an ambiguous stimulus. We're going to observe the creation and find out what it means. What the person says it means is all important. And we might have our little interpretations through our field or whatever. Those don't matter, and we keep them to ourselves. The person's interpretation matters. So the kid's playing with soldiers, and one soldier shoots another, and the other's trying on high heels or whatever it is. We're not telling them what that means. We're asking them what that means. Right? Okay. Good. And then we have modern psychodynamic psychotherapies. These they have a long and complicated history, and our job here is not necessarily to get into that. If you like these ideas, then chase them down. But Anna Freud starts object relations. Anna is Sigmund's daughter, and she is somewhat of a feminist, but wants to believe what her dad said was true because he's her father, and of course wants to write his coattails a little. Anybody would. So she comes up with object relations theory, and then Melanie Klein, a feminist form of psychoanalysis, and so many people lead us to where we are. But the modern psychodynamic practitioner, it genetically is Freudian, even though they're going to discount really all the interpretive frameworks as weird and sexist and kind of sky castle, right? The important thing is that one thing stands for another. Remember, for Freud, we don't have a relationship with the patient. The relationship stands for some other relationship that they had in the past. The feeling that they have isn't what they feel. So for Freud, really whatever you feel is going to come back to weird, inappropriate sexuality. The Freudian slip, when you say one thing and mean your mother, Libido is the driving force, the life energy, not mere sexuality, but sexuality is for sure in there. The libidinous energy drives the id, and everything boils down to that. Um, is it true? No. Is it useful? It turns out if you practice that way, you help about 80% of the people you work with. But that's carried forward into psychodynamic therapies, not necessarily that everything boils down to sex, the way that the classic analyst might see things. Um, but they stand for something else. You're not afraid of of being promoted. You're afraid of some experience you had 40 years ago, and this stands for that. And if we can drag that unconscious memory out into the light, then you won't be afraid anymore of this promotion. um, Transference is going to be huge. We're always looking for that transference, and like some of the modern psychodynamic folks worry about the transference, that it's bad, because now we sit face to face and we do try to have some relationship. We're more present in the therapy, so transference would seem weird and bad. Remember, for Freud, it's the whole point of the thing is to get at that. Countertransference, still bad. And then we might be able to do some analytic work. The job would be maybe to turn something unpleasant into something controllable. So if we were in class and I could make eye contact with you and see if people were in distress, there's a little exercise we do that for now I'm just going to describe. All right. So the idea is we get people to get nice and comfortable on the couch, and it's a comfortable couch, facing each other, but comfortable, close their eyes. And then I'm going to ask them to imagine, don't do this actually for yourself, but I'm going to ask the person to imagine a feeling that they have, center in your experience, some breathing exercises, whatever, relax, partial self-hypnosis, meditation. Now examine your body internally, and is there a feeling in your body? Don't tell me what it is, but once the person's identified it for themselves, start to visualize that feeling. So would it have a color? What color is that feeling? You see the dynamic part of here, the changing part here, right? We're changing the abstraction of a body sensation or the precursor of an emotion into something with color. We're visualizing it. And then would it have a texture? Would it be rough or smooth? Would it be granular? Would it have a temperature when you touch it? Would it have a shape? Does it have jagged edges, or is it well rounded? Or right? And then once we have a mental picture of the emotion, we're just going to start to breathe into it like it were a balloon. So you have the patient imagine they put a straw into it and they exhale into the straw, so that every time they exhale, that feeling is blowing up like a balloon. And it's taking on 3 dimensions. It's getting bigger and bigger, but as it gets bigger, just like a balloon, it starts to attenuate. It stretches out. It gets thinner. So the color that was really intense at the beginning fades out into a pastel, and the texture that it has smooths out like the surface of a balloon, until eventually the thing is full of air and it's stretched out and attenuated and pale. All the sharp edges have been rounded off, and then you can pull out the straw and the thing will slowly float away, and you can observe the feeling just float off into the atmosphere. Does that make your feelings go away? Yeah, for a second. For a second it does. You're doing this cognitive work, this meditative work. Does your feeling literally float away because you visualized it? No, but the work of sitting in your frontal lobe doing this creative, imaginative exercise does take your focus off whatever is making you anxious or angry or whatever it is for a while. So in the short term, you learn to gain a measure of control over these unpleasant experiences. Yeah. All right. So that is all that I want you to know about the Freudian stuff. We'll be back in a second with whatever the next thing is.